I'll tell you about the strange friendship between the two murderers, Vladimir Putin and Bashar al-Assad, and how this friendship is connected with Ukraine. It is worth starting with what pushed the two sadistic dictators into each other's arms. In the 21st century, there are almost no classical tyrannies left on the planet, in which everything is subordinated to the will of a single dictator. There are, of course, absolute monarchies like Saudi Arabia, but even there, the rulers are forced to listen to the opinions of various groups within society and respond to criticism not only with the help of lashes and gallows, but also with the help of reforms. Even the obscurantist regime of the Iranian Ayatollahs rests on the collective decisions made by several politicians and theologians from the Council of Elders, with an eye to the opinion of the street. The model dictator Robert Mugabe from Zimbabwe was replaced by a whole junta, which, by the way, overthrew him. This junta has a first among equals, but he is also obliged to reckon with the opinions of the rest. That is, Vladimir Putin, who came to power in year 2000 and gained real tyrannical power after about a decade and a half in the head of Russia, became a dictator when the very idea of dictatorship finally fizzled out. The modern dictator is not Lee Kuan Yew or General Franco. This is some kind of villain fool from comics, like the son and father Berdimuhamedovs who reign supreme in Turkmenistan, or the equally evil and senseless Kims from North Korea. Their comicality were obvious even too far from the most intelligent Vladimir Putin. Perhaps that is why, having finally established himself in the status of dictator, he was in no hurry to establish especially warm relations with these characters. Another thing is Bashar al-Assad. He is very similar to Putin. Both came to power by accident. Al-Assad after the death of his older brother, who was supposed to become the president of Syria. Putin because the entourage of ex-Russian President Boris Yeltsin staked on him. They were simply brought into the light of the day and declared heads of the state. No real political struggle, no ideology at all, no long-term career. Bam, and the president. Both grew up in an environment that, let's face it, made them sadists. Bashar al-Assad has watched since childhood as his father, Syrian President Hafez al-Assad, cracked down on unwanted people, carried out mass executions, and sent troops to disperse peaceful protests. Young Bashar grew up with the understanding that violence is normal and even necessary. In gloomy Soviet Leningrad, Putin was taught something similar. Contrary to the Soviet and modern Russian propaganda, violence was everywhere in the USSR, and even in schools there were orders sometimes similar to prison ones. Let me tell you with my own experience. I started studying at school during the Soviet Union, and in my school, an ordinary Soviet school, one student shot another because of some nonsense. He ran home during the school break for the pistol of his father, a policeman, and killed a classmate. It was 1989, long before Columbine and other mass school shootings in the West. Putin grew up in even poorer and more difficult times, and being weak and cowardly boy from childhood, he was accustomed not only to cruelty but also to actions on the sly, to lie and dodge. For a long time, the two dictators were united by the desire for respectability. They liked to be included in the circle of international leaders, to host championships, summits and conferences in their countries, and in general to pretend to be real politicians, not dictators who are kept in power by repressions, persecutions of freedom of speech and reprisals against the opposition. For al-Assad, this spectacle ended in 2011 with the beginning of the Arab Spring. For Putin, in 2014 with the occupation of the Ukrainian Crimea and the start of the war in the Donbass. True, Putin then only partially fell out of the international cage, but all more or less self-respecting states turned their backs on al-Assad. His ultra-violence toward protesters, his willingness to destroy entire cities just to stay in power led to a breakdown in the relations with the entire civilized world. The place of this civilized world was taken by Russia. After occupation of Crimea and part of the Donbass, Putin also launches a military operation in Syria. In 2015, 15 Russian sailors, pilots, scouts and whole crowd of mercenary infantrymen were sent there. Then there was a lot of controversy about why Moscow needs someone else war, why Russia should interfere in what is happening in the Middle East, why support a regime with which the Kremlin had not previously had particularly warm relations. Various hypotheses were then put forward. Politicians and journalists said that by getting into someone else's war, Putin is trying to skyrocket the price of oil and gas due to which Russia exists. It was said that Putin wanted to play politics on a global scale, so he entered this war. But now, after the outbreak of a large-scale war in Ukraine, it is becoming increasingly clear that Putin's main goal in Syria was to prepare the army for an invasion in the neighboring country, test weapons and equipment that are now used to kill Ukrainians, and prepare public opinion for war. All these missiles, which one after another fall on Kharkiv and Mykolaiv, have already been falling on Aleppo and Idlib for several years. The planes that these missiles launch have already been noted in the Syrian sky. War crimes in Ukraine are very often committed by those who previously robbed, tortured and raped Syrian civilians. It is very likely that Putin's entire Syrian adventure was preparation for a massive invasion in Ukraine. Even then, 8 or 9 years ago, he made plans to seize the entire country. Initially, apparently, it was planned to take over Ukraine with the help of local fifth column and mercenaries from Russia. It happened in Donetsk and Lugansk, but not in Odessa or Zaporizhia. After recovering from the first shock of their neighbors' insiders' attack, the Ukrainians went on the defensive and did not give Putin the opportunity to swallow their state. When most likely Putin began preparation for a big war. Syria turned out to be a convenient training ground for him to train an army of murderers, a country in which they could do whatever they wanted, destroy entire cities, set up ghettos, bomb humanitarian convoys, torture and execute. Russian propagandists explained the intervention in Syria in much the same way as they now explain the intervention in Ukraine. There are dangerous terrorists there who can threaten us. We need to destroy them outside of Russia, otherwise they will come to Russia very soon. Bashar al-Assad was only glad what the Russians were doing in his country, because without massacres, without committing all imaginable and unimaginable war crimes, it was impossible for him to retain in power. In fact, he stayed in his chair on Russian bayonets, bayonets stained with blood of thousands and thousands of Syrians. The Russians deliberately destroyed schools and hospitals in the territories controlled by the rebels, deliberately killed women and children. The commanders really raised an army of scum who will stop at nothing. It was the desire to train all this scum, to prepare them for massacre in Ukraine,